Welcome to the Business of Soil Health. I'm your host, Patrick Smith, and the founder of Soil Upside. I'm really happy to have Jerel Kratt with us today. Jerel is the president and the CEO at Regenerative Crop Consulting and the owner of Covenant Pastures. Welcome, Jerel.
Thank you, Patrick. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So you have a unique perspective. You are an independent agronomist working with growers there in the Central Valley, California. Can you tell us a little bit about your work, who your clients are, all that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. So I started Regenerative Crop Consulting about 3 years ago. And before that, I was working for one of the more major plant nutrient ag chem companies. I've been in the ag business for 27 years now. And so I took that background that I had and just decided to go all the way in into the regenerative sphere as a consultant. It started off just trying to help consult growers to learn how to adopt regenerative and soil health practices in California on the crops that we, primarily have that have value here, like almonds and pistachios and citrus and grapes and wine grapes, table grapes. So a lot of permanent crops, fruit and nut crops. It really started as a consulting part, and that's like the part of the company name was Regenerative Crop Consulting. Within a pretty short amount of time, I realized that this is going to be kind of an uphill battle. Growers don't tend to want to hire consultants too much. They tend to be still very closely involved with their agronomist or their field rep from the big ag chem companies, who are making recommendations still on the farm. And there's going to be some friction and contradictory advice given there. And so they tend to want to stick with that as their consultant, but they have a much easier time buying products through different companies, right? So I started adapting my approach more away from just a consulting service and into a product-oriented service, but then still offering the expert advice and the consulting. So trying to blend the worlds, if you will, those two different spheres.
To kind of summarize what I'm hearing, I think, is that you saw that common purchase behavior is to buy inputs and get agronomy advice from ag retailers. And so you have essentially moved more into that, maybe kind of bridging those two worlds, but the purchase behavior with your customers is much more around biologicals, biostimulants, and maybe even some of the more traditional inputs. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for example, almonds had been up until recently when the almond market kind of collapsed in California. Almonds were probably the number one crop I was working with. And they're so heavily input oriented, right? There's just a lot of nitrogen inputs and liquid potassium. And especially in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley of California, it tends to be significantly drier than in the northern part, right? Which adds to the whole practical, part of it. So a lot of liquid chemical fertigation is what happens in the southern part of the valley, because we get maybe 6 to 8 inches of rain a year, and that mostly only falling, in the wintertime or spring, that's it. And so we don't use spreadable products. We've had problems with compost for years because the ground's already hard through just the practices of keeping orchards bare, driving lots of equipment across the orchard. Nothing's really growing, spraying herbicides. So it's dead, hard ground. And so then a grower may want to start off in the soil health sphere by let's put compost down. Well, then what happens in this environment when you do that is it sits on top of the ground, dries out, and then blows away. And there's obviously a small amount of benefit that comes from it, but that's not a real practical, or good practice, right? I think. And what's interesting is in the regenerative sphere, the first practice they'll recommend is they'll put compost out, right? And there's some really big name people, and I'm not going to call them out, and I'm not going to throw them under the bus or anything, but they tend to all come from the Midwest, been doing it for a while out there. And then they come to California and they tell people out here how to do regenerative. And, it's kind of like this one size fits all. And it almost always is put out cover crops and put out compost. Right. And that is not what's going to make you regenerative. It may not even improve your soil health down here because of how bad things are, right? So, and they don't really see that because they're not spending enough time in this area. That's kind of like a traveling evangelist. They have like their circuit, it's like a church, a religion almost, right? They got this message, they got their books, and they're popular, and they come swinging into the state, and they give their message to these conferences. People show up, it's great. And then they leave and they try to implement it, and it doesn't quite work out, right? Because there's a lot of agronomic challenges that are going on. And we haven't even touched on the economic side of it, right? So if a grower was to completely pull back from the traditional way, the conventional way of fertilizing, and start doing it with compost and cover crops, they'll have no crop. I mean, it'll decline by 80% within 2 years. And I've got case after case that I can show you that that's happened. And so, and the drier the climate, the farther south down the valley you go, the more reality that becomes. You can get away with that when you go up north and like above Sacramento for certain, and definitely above Modesto in that area, that northern part of the San Joaquin in the Sacramento Valley, they may get 25, 30 inches of rain. That's a huge difference between the 6 or 8 inches that we're getting down, like in Bakersfield, for example. And so when you have that type of climate and that type of rainfall, it's much more forgiving. And so you can put compost down if you time it right and get a response. You can put cover crops out and they'll change the soil in one season, right? And that's not to say that I don't use compost or cover crops with my clients, because there's a place for that. But that's not the way that I tackle it. It's a little bit different approach than that.
One of the things in regen that's talked about a lot is that it's context specific. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you're saying that many of the accepted kind of orthodox regenerative practices are not necessarily applicable to your region and your context, at least at the beginning of a regenerative transition for producers. And so it sounds like you're leaning into biologicals and biostimulants as a way to really kickstart the process, as opposed to those more traditional practices.
That's absolutely correct. And that's actually what really gave me the courage to do what I'm doing now. Is so before I started regenerative crop consulting, I had been working with 2 or 3 of my key core customers, farmers that I've had for a decade or more as my customer, and we were exploring different biological and biostimulant products. These trials were extremely successful on a couple of products, and then a whole lot of other products, they were not at all successful. I really kind of was trying to take like an Elaine Ingham foundation of robust soil biology, right? So I want, in these permanent crops, I want to have fungally dominant soils. Like the fungal to bacteria ratio, I want to be above 1.0. And of course, they would say, like, for permanent crops, you need to be 3 to 5 to 1 ratio. But like when you start out and I take the first, soil biology test, and it's, 0.25 to 1 fungal to bacteria ratio, meaning like it's extremely bacterial and there's no fungi at all. And most of the inoculants that are on the marketplace are like what or have been colloquially called bugs in a jug, right? So it's like something off the shelf. It's almost all some strains of bacteria. They may be dead. Who knows how long they've been sitting there. They get blended in with chemical fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen and whatnot. We don't even know if they survive at that point. They get put into the farmer system. And this is what's promoted by the big ag chem companies, right? So all the big companies have some sort of biological that they're out there promoting, that they add on to their program that they give a grower. And these products tend to have 300 to 500% markup, at least, if not more. So they're very profitable for these companies to do it. And it makes the grower feel good, like, oh, well, I'm really doing something for soil health because I'm putting out XYZ product, right? My experience has been these products don't actually do anything. When you really dig down to, like, have they improved your soil structure? Have they improved your water infiltration? Have they allowed you to cut back on your chemical inputs significantly? Not like 5 to 10%, which is a number that I see bandied about by the big ag chem companies. Oh, well, we cut back our NPK by 10% or 15%. Well, what about 50%? Could we cut it back 50%? Those are the kind of numbers that I started seeing, like, we really could cut back. And if I just did compost and cover crop and spent, let's see, that would cost $150 an acre minimum, if not $200 an acre for a grower to do that. Okay. I could, for $50 to $100, put on some of these biologicals and biostimulant products and actually get measurable improvements, like actual measurable improvements the first year into the second year. Whereas I could not get that with just a cover crop compost model alone. Now, I really want to back up just a little bit and be sure to express that I do believe cover crops are probably one of the quickest way to break up compaction if you do them properly. So I don't want to be throwing cover crops under the bus, but what I do want to say is from a nutritional standpoint of releasing nutrients to a hungry crop like almonds, for example, you're not going to get the nutrients that you think you're going to get from that cover crop. And the biggest reason why is because the highest peak growth time period for a cover crop is simultaneous. It's concurrent with the peak nutrient demand of an almond crop, right? So there's too much competition with the standard cover crop mix and with the growth of, say, the almond crop. And so you really have to manage it. And so you just think about those numbers, like the nutrients are not there, right? There's just not enough carbon. There's not enough nitrogen. So you put a cover crop in and the soil just sucks it up, right? I mean, none of it is available for the crop yet. So that's why, long story short, to answer your question, biologicals and biostimulants bridged that gap of that lag that I was finding there.
Well, it sounds like you're saying a couple things there. Yes, biologicals and biostimulants have been crucial. And at the same time, they're in a hype cycle. And I've heard producers talking about how bugs and jugs are showing up on farm radio all the time. And, there's, to your point, there's high margins for some of the traditional ag retailers and manufacturers in producing them. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is both traditional practices and biologicals and biostimulants, there's nuances to all of that application, depending on context, depending on the efficacy of the product. It seems like, and this is across the country, it seems like agronomists are coming up to speed on all of these soil health and biogeochemical, the sort of holistic perspective at the same time as producers are. And I'm curious for producers in other regions of the country, if they're in the Central Valley, clearly they should call you, but for producers in other regions of the country, how do they find people that are doing what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say to them, you could really drill down and ask them, like, do you think regenerative ag has a future? And if so, what do you think that is? And that might be really telling in and of itself. I think you're going to have three different camps that you'll find. The majority will be like, well, it's not proven. I don't think we even haven't defined it yet. I don't think it's really going to be profitable. It's all about cutting inputs and, being natural. And, that's going to be like the perception. And that's going to be the majority of agronomists are going to look at it through that lens. Then there's going to be the opposite extreme of that, which I think are what I call the evangelists. The evangelists in California tend to be some of the farmers I know that really, really want to be purists and do it like 100% regenerative and have an aversion to inputs. So they are the caricature of what the people on the conventional side, said, and that's why they want to stay away from it, right? There's those people, and they tend to be influenced by the really big name regen ag people from across the country or across the world, right? And then there's those of us, I think, that are a bit more hybridized in the middle. And not to put us all in the same category, we all may have different beliefs on what regen is and what the future is. But I think we've all come to a collective judgment that it's going to require taking growers slowly out of the conventional model, weaning them off the chemistry so that we don't lose profit and yield. And I'm not focused on yield, focused on profit. Profit is the key. But yeah, so I mean, I think if a grower were to ask them their opinion on those things, like where they fall, right? How do they believe it can be accomplished? Let them speak and listen to them talk, and then they'll find out what their approach is, right? That's what I
Yeah,
would suggest. Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about some of those results that you're mentioning, the economic side of this, because earlier you talked about reducing inputs, NPK inputs, in some cases by 50% or more. Does it decrease the cost basis based on the input prices of biologicals? But also, I'm curious about just the overall economic outcomes that you're seeing. You mentioned profit as being a key one. I've talked to other folks who are in the biologicals and biostimulant space who talk about immediately increased yield and vigor. So obviously that's top line also. I'm just curious, give us your kind of overview on where you see additional profit being derived from taking this hybrid approach.
Yeah. Well, there's no real market yet for regeneratively grown produce and crops in California, right? So as far as when I say market, like buyers, right, they're very limited right now. And so there's no real premiums on this, right? Like even organic has premiums, though, that they've been declining. And I know there's lots of, organizations that have come along that are trying to build that, right? And I think it will eventually come. I think consumers want it, but it's just not quite there yet, right? So how do we drive increased profit? Well, there's like two approaches, right? One is cut costs and hope that you don't decline yield, right? This is kind of the more purist regenerative approach. Jonathan Lundgren's approach, for example, and Tommy Finster published a paper on regeneratively grown almonds in California, where the cost per acre for production was significantly less than the conventional model. Again, but then that has its own context because it depends on, are you paying for water in an expensive area where water is super expensive? And most of their studies were in areas that the water was much more available and a lot less expensive than, say, in the southern part of the state. So that's a factor that has to come into play. Or, your land value, your rent, or your interest payments and all that come into play, right? But aside from that, so it's the cut the cost model, right? And then your yields come down a little bit, but your profit increases, right? So that's kind of that world of regenerative. And then like my approach is not really that approach, right? I mean, if you want to do that, fine, I'll support you. I'm not going to like say you shouldn't do it, but if you want to do it and you think you can make it, then I'll help you. That's fine. But in my opinion, I think we need to shift to, we're going to have to increase yields and try to cut costs if we can, or at least keep yields the same and cut costs, or keep costs the same and dramatically increase yields, right? So there's layers of nuance that can happen, and it really kind of depends on the quality of your ground, the class of your ground, and your ability as a farmer, right? And your varieties that you've planted. Some of these guys have terrible root stocks or variety selections that are disease prone, that are never been known to yield very well. And with a permanent crop, you're stuck with it for 25 or more years, right? So they made these decisions, and that has a part to play in it too, right? I think you have to aim a bit more for yield, right? And I know that that's going to raise some red flags with some people, but I think you do, right? And these biologicals, if they're done right and they're good quality, and I have a couple that I work with that I've really been impressed with, can get you there. And we have seen that happen.
Let's talk about some of the other outcomes. So we've talked about reducing NPK, we've talked about yield. Can you talk about some of the agronomic outcomes, in particular around water and soil organic matter, that you're seeing?
So water infiltration has improved dramatically when we open up the ground. So if we can reduce the amount of salts that we put in the system, because all these conventional fertilizers are very salty. And I don't mean salt in the sense of like sodium or table salt, like a lot of people think when they hear salt. I mean, it's just a salt index for it. It's a salt compound, right? They tend to displace the soil texture, and the aggregation of the soil, right? And so it tends to create like this resistance to water infiltration because of that, right? And then of course the practice of spraying everything bare with herbicides, like obviously when there's no living plant, there's no living root, that's been gone for a long time, right? In the valley for the most part. That obviously creates a major surface tension of the soil and impermeability of water. So these practices that we've been talking about, I mean, that's a major agronomic outcome, is improved water infiltration, which obviously translates into improved water use, right? So A lot of the growers that I've been working with as we transition out of conventional to a more hybridized regenerative model have been reluctant to cut back so much on their water, because even though they see that their soil is changing and they see that they're getting much better water infiltration, there tends to still be this idea that, well, crops need X amount of acre feet of water per whatever, per 1,000 pounds or per acre, whatever the metric is that the university, came up with for each different crop, right? So when you still kind of have that in the back of your head, the idea is like the first hurdle was pulling back fertilizer, but I can quantify that with sap tests or soil tests, right? Like, oh, we have it in the plant, we don't need to apply it. It's there, right? We see it. The water part of it becomes a harder thing for growers to get over that emotional hurdle, because they can see, like with probing or with cores or whatever, I can take them out there and we can physically show them that their infiltration's improving and their water use is improving. But then they'll say, well, don't we still need 3.5 acre feet of water to grow a 3,000 pound crop or whatever the number is, and so it's kind of like, well, I mean, where did these people come up with this number in the first place, right?
Being a producer in California is super hard for lots of reasons, but not the least of which is regulatory pressure. Mm-hmm. And if we have all of the concern about water, particularly groundwater, and tree crops' use of groundwater, now SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California, was enacted in 2014, but my understanding is that it's really starting to take effect now and starting to see some real impacts on permanent crop production. Can you talk about if that's even a factor with some of the water management practices?
We talk about it, right? So, I mean, we talk about the future of water and water use and improving water efficiency and things like that. So that is part of the conversation. But I mean, SGMA is a big political football. I think 4 years ago, growers are kind of like still ignoring it. Like it's like not really going to be a thing to worry about. Somehow politically we maybe overturn it and it's going to be gone. But I think everyone's kind of given up on that idea now, and they realize it's here, it's to stay, and it's a reality. Now we got to deal with it. The most large farmers, the big large corporate farms, I mean, they're just going to just keep buying up cheap ground where they can and not farm it, right? So there's restrictions to that too, because at first I think some growers are thinking they could buy ground on one side of the valley that's not really even in their groundwater basin, but it could help them where they're at. And now we're seeing like that's not going to be allowed. A lot of the sustainable plans that were made by the different irrigation districts are being rejected by the state, and at the state level they're just basically like crossing everything out that the irrigation districts and the different areas, water management areas have sent into them, and they're just like, no, that this is not going to work. It's not sustainable. So, I mean, there's a real strong negative attitude towards the state of California by farmers. I would almost say there's a loathing and a hatred for the state of California at the political level. They see the politicians as being from the big cities, don't understand farming, don't understand that they're trying to feed people that basically the belief is they want the farming to go away in the San Joaquin Valley, or mostly go away. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a polarized battle that there's no real place for me in it at this point to fight that, to get in the middle of it, because I think they're looking for political solutions, and the agronomic solutions, the regenerative solutions are only going to take you so far, right? I mean, so if they're looking at cutting back the amount of water that's being pumped by 50% across the state or more, well, we haven't been able to achieve that much water savings through a regenerative mindset. And if I could take another minute or two to go a little bit deeper, this requires an understanding of our climate and our soils, and why we are struggling to build organic matter, even in a fully, completely regenerative model, not a hybridized model, but just like a really true, pure regenerative model. It's still slow building organic matter. And I believe it's because, our rainfall is only in the cooler months. We don't have any rain for like 9 months out of the year, the hottest 9 months of the year when everything's baking. And yes, you could keep the ground armored, but we don't have the water now to keep something green living, which is a tenet, one of the 5 or 6 tenets of regenerative agriculture, is to keep a plant living, you know. Well, you can't do that when you don't have rain, and then you can't pump water, or you don't have access to surface water, right? So you could do dead brown ground cover mulch, and that helps. But these things are not sufficient to overcome the restrictions that Sigma is going to put into place. The ultimate reality is there's going to be a dramatic reduction in the amount of farmland farmed in California.
It sounds like what you're saying is that we have political factors and we have agronomic solutions, but the two are not, they're not communicating. They're not aligned right now.
Yeah, for sure. Right. So, I mean, they're not aligned. And then I also would say, I would caution anyone thinking that a purist regenerative approach is going to be the salvation. Build organic matter, even in the best possible idealistic regenerative model, we build it slower by a factor of 10 at least than they do in the prairie. Okay, just because of the way the prairie soils are and the weather, the climate. And I don't care if it's in the north or in the south part of the prairie, you can build your organic matter incredibly faster out there than you can in California. It's a different soil type and a different Mediterranean climate that is a slower geological process to forming soils, right? Again, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing these practices to help, but we got to be realistic about how much we can actually achieve with these things, right? And so if the state is not willing, because the state wants us to go regenerative too, right? They'll say that, but the state is not willing to adjust their water policies to allow some of these practices to happen, which I think can be done. I'm not saying I'm in agreement with what Sigma is saying should be done. That also doesn't mean to say I don't think there's been a problem with overpumping. There absolutely has been, and that needs to stop. But the one size fits all, let's just bring everything down to this unrealistically low number that no one can achieve, is going to do nothing but destroy the entire agriculture industry in this state.
Can you talk a little bit about producers' reaction to the word regenerative, particularly in California? Because it seems like it's changed pretty dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years. I was talking to a pistachio processor 3 years ago who had an in-house regenerative program, and then I talked to them 6 months ago, and they said to me, regen is dead.
The big name corporations and industry players, they're the ones that mostly say regen is dead. They haven't really given it much of a shot beyond the, pull back inputs, put on compost and plant some cover crops, and everyone saw their yields go down. Right. So everyone saw their yields go down, and it happened concurrently, except for me. I will say, because of my hybridized model, none of my customers saw yield decline. So I mean, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit. It's like through hard work and perseverance and keeping our inputs up, as SAP tests would tell us we need to do, we maintained yield and improved soil health, improved all those metrics that we've already talked about. I won't repeat them. But generally, most of the key players kind of went from just this, it just was about carbon. It was just about organic matter. And everyone struggled to build carbon, doing it the way that the guru said to do it. So then that happens concurrently while the almond market collapsed. Now, the almond market collapse had nothing to do with, so that's coincidental, but you drop prices down like 50 to 70% from where they were, and you no longer can even make a profit if all your input costs were just water and labor, right? And fuel, like no fertilizer or chemicals. You still are like struggling to break even at that point. So you have that majorly negative pressure of the economic market on the almond prices for growers. And so now when the interest is starting to really come up to be regenerative, it's just not a good time for growers, right? So the institutional owners and buyers, they pull back saying like, well, we don't want the risk of something like this. If our yields do decline, we cannot afford our yields to decline in this negative market like this. So say in the southern part of San Joaquin Valley, if your water and your land and your interest and your labor are already above what the break-even cost is, it's just like at that point, it's like, what do you want to spend money on for a crop? You could spend no money and just to see what happens. You could spend a couple $100 more an acre that you don't have for some regenerative practices, like some cover crops and compost. Or you could just put that $200 into like cheap conventional nitrogen fertilizer, because we all know almonds need nitrogen to grow. That's been the big issue. We're trying to like, how do we get almonds sufficient nitrogen? Because these regenerative models are having a hard time providing enough nitrogen because their organic matter is so low, right? It's all connected. If you see everything I've been saying, it's all interconnected. So it's like a grower is going to say, well, what do I spend my money on, right? The dollars I don't have, do I spend it at all? And if I do, what do I spend it on? Well, I'm not spending it on regenerative, because it's still too much of an unknown. It's still too much of a risk. They've seen too many players come at it like this, the purest way, and fail, right? So it killed it. It definitely killed it. It killed the interest, let's say, the
Yeah,
enthusiasm.
totally. It sounds like there's kind of two different threads here. One is the sort of purist practice-based approach didn't work immediately, and that coincided with the collapse of the almond and some other nut markets. And so producers are really in survival mode, in which case it's really hard to start to experiment with novel new approaches. And so I'm curious, how do you sell your services then? You have regenerative in the name of your business.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm thinking about changing my business name. So if you have any suggestions, but I've been saying I'm going to keep the same name because I have enough now recognition, certainly not broadly across the entire state, but I've built enough of a recognition that it's hard to like change a name, right? But it may be time to do that. I certainly have struggled to grow the business. I pick up new customers here and there, but it's not because of promoting regen ag. It's because I've been an agronomist for 27 years. I'm well known by at least a certain segment of the industry. I've produced good results for a significant number of growers. I do have a great mastery on plant nutrition. I mean, that has been my backbone. That's what I cut my teeth on. That's what I became an expert in, is plant nutrition. And so that's what has saved me. That's what's allowed me to be successful, is I don't let the plant nutrition fail, which is why I have a suite of, very thoughtful, plant nutrition products that I recommend based on the testing, the SAP testing that we do, that have significantly proven themselves, that are differentiated enough from the big ag chem guys. Between that and the biologicals I have, like, it's a great program that proves itself over and over again. But how do I grow that? How do I get people to recognize that or see that? That has been the big struggle, right? And so word of mouth has been the number one thing that has worked for me, and reaching out to growers that I've known over my career here in California. And so that's how I built the business in the first place. Was I was able to have a foundation of people that had been with me for so long, right? And then I would ask them if they could make referrals or spread word of mouth or things like that, right? But I haven't done a big marketing campaign across the state or anything like that. Partner.
Yeah, the results of your work speaking for themselves, really. Well, it sounds like, with all of the factors, the market factors in California, some of the controversy around the word regen or potential dilution of that, all of the Groundwater Management Act, like there's a lot of headwinds, and clearly you're still in this and you're committed to it. I know you have a little bit of a personal story about why, but can you share that with us? Like, why do you have the level of commitment that you do around this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, well, let's see. I think my eyes started opening with our firstborn son, who's turning 21 I'm actually in his bedroom. This is not mine right here.
You're
right?
using his gaming rig for this.
I'm using his gaming rig. I don't have equipment like this, and he's got all the tech stuff. He's an aspiring physicist, computer science guy, you know. Anyway, so he was really, really ill as a young child, a toddler, and by the time he was 4 years old, he was had shown some pretty significant, you know, autism spectrum type disorder, developmental stuff, and just not talking and eyes not working and kind of the drooling, saggy lip and not acting like he can hear anything, you know. It was alarming to his mom and I. It was very alarming, and had friends that had a child that at that time was, when we knew them, when my son was 4, their son was 15, and he had some similar problems, and they told us about this like natural alternative doctor in Seattle. We were living in Washington State at the time, and so we went to him, and it just was like a gateway. He helped. I mean, basically within 6 months, all of those things had reversed. He started talking. He could look at you straight. The saggy, drooly lip cleared up. The ear pain went away. I couldn't believe it, right? And we're talking about things like, you know, he was telling us about vaccines and pesticides and nutritional status, you know, and he was doing light therapy, with lasers and cranial adjustments, like shifting the cranial plates around so you get the nerve flow in there. And this was like my first visit there. I was watching Dr. McCoy from Star Trek use his, I'm just like, okay, you know, I'm a conventional farmer guy, right? And born and bred, and like that's just science and what we know, and this is like out in woo-woo land, right? But it worked. Our whole family started going to this doctor, and I realized like I had all these allergy issues and some autoimmune issues that I just kind of would power through and kind of ignore, and my health started improving. And so it was like, you know, there's multi facets to it, but one key facet was food, right? And so that we really were paying attention to what are the foods that we're eating, and what's the nutritional density of this food, and what's the pesticide level on these foods, right? And I had pesticide poisoning. I've had tests. I've done the blood, hair, urine tests, and I've done many detoxes for my exposure from pesticides and heavy metals and things like that. And so I really like woke up, I guess you'd say, to like how our food system is so poisoned. Of course, I'm working in it, so like I had a little bit of a crisis of conscious, like, okay, now how do I make all this work, right? So the first step was starting our own farm, growing our own food, which became a farm, which is Covenant Pastures, and in that, you know, so I'm doing grass-fed, grass-finished beef was like the main core of things that I started working with, and I started learning about holistic grazing. You know, I met Joel Salatin. I went out to Virginia, spent some time. I took a couple courses, got certified, you know, met Joel, met Daniel. You know, that was a great experience. Then I went to Allen Savory Center, the Holistic Management Institute, got certified there, took a course in that. So now I'm like doing like holistic grazing, which is just like, it's all part of this regenerative world, right? And so
you were doing that at the same time that you were selling traditional inputs.
Yeah, and because I do want to say that the traditional inputs, the company I had worked for 17 years before I went on my own, did not manufacture or sell pesticides or fungicides or anything like that. They were all plant nutrients, and they were all like naturally derived and made with organic acids. And so we were promoting soil health and natural nutrient products like that whole time I was there. But everyone in the company, we were all very conventional and pro-conventional minded. All our customers were basically conventional. And so no one would ever dare say you should stop using pesticides, right? It's how do you feed the world? We gotta spray because we won't have crops if we don't spray. I never was selling pesticides, but we were in the world of that, right? And so, yes, but to answer your question, I was still doing that job while I'm coming awake with all this other stuff, you know, especially at my own place. And that's where I started dabbling in soil biology, right? I was subscribing to the Stockman Grass Farmer, and there was an article by Alan Williams in there, and this is like 7 or 8 years ago or whatever. And he was talking about sending your soil samples up to a place called Earth Fort in Oregon that tests, their soil for its biological profile through using microscopes, right? They were actually the ones that I first started getting involved with their biologicals that were really working well. I've since then been working with another company called Living Water that I really like, and that's been extremely successful.
It sounds like the way that your personal experience connects with your professional experience is that you saw the connection between human health and natural solutions and nutrient density and food production. And you're applying that with plant nutrition and with all the soil microbiology and the holistic biogeochemical approach to analyzing plant nutrition and crop production.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, that's really cool. Jerel, I really appreciate your work, particularly out there in California where there's so many headwinds. Is there anything that you want to leave everybody with?
Well, okay. We've been talking so much of kind of almost in a negative sphere. I always like to end something on a real positive note. I think that there's value to thinking positively, thinking creatively, looking for the best in everyone. As much as I may challenge some of the institutional players and the big corporations out there, they're here, they're not going away. And I think that if we could all collectively work together for the common good, I think that we'll all be better for it, right? If we can stop warring with each other and, having these labels of like, well, this is regenerative and regenerative's dead. Well, you're not regenerative because you're not doing it the way I say it should be done. If we could maybe back away from both of those and just say, how can we collaborate? How can we all get better? Then we're all going to succeed.
Yeah, finding the middle ground of commonality as opposed to the extremes.
Yes.
Yeah. Jerel, thank you very much. Really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Business of Soil Health. Our goal is to explore how new financial tools may or may not support producers' stewardship of their soil. We love hearing from listeners, so don't hesitate to reach out with any suggestions or guests you'd like for us to feature. And don't forget to subscribe or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform.